Hello, welcome to the iCope Stress and Relaxation Workshop. My name is Hedvig Nessie. I'm one of the psychological wellbeing practitioners, and I have Chiara with me here. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name's Chiara Lowsley. I'm also one of the psychological wellbeing practitioners here with you today.
So the workshop today will be for about an hour, and we'll talk you through some techniques in how to deal with stress. So iCope is a improving access to psychological therapy service. That means that we support people who experience mild to moderate anxiety and depression, but we also support people who are experiencing other things. Primarily, our therapy is based on the cognitive behavioural model, so something that's called CBT. Although we support people with depression and anxiety, it's also important to know that we're not a crisis service. But there is a lot of support available for anyone who is in a crisis and in need of more support. So we know that it's really common for people who experience anxiety or depression to maybe experience thoughts of suicide or self-harm. And we just want you to know where you can reach out for support if that was the case. So there's quite a lot of different support available, from contacting your GP for an emergency appointment, or if it's more urgent and you're in a situation where you feel like you can't keep yourself safe, you can go to A&E where there's a mental health team to speak with. And also there's a crisis team in Islington that you can call anytime if you are feeling at risk to yourself in any way. And if it's more emotional support that you're looking for, then you can call the Samaritans. They are available for free any time of the day. But there's also an app that we often recommend to people that you can download. It's called Stay Alive, and it's an app that you can use to help keep yourself safe, where you can customize it and put in different things of support that you might want to have in place. So just a couple of helpful tips before we get started. You might find it useful to have a pen and paper ready, but also we've got some supplementary materials that you can download that goes with this workshop. And as we go through the different slides, you might want to pause and try out some of the different tasks. So you're free to do that anytime, but also take a break if you need that. And as we go through things, you might also notice that there are some things that feels more relevant than others. So do make sure that you maybe write down anything that's particularly useful, or you could also take a screenshot or a photo of the slides, and you can go back and forth as you wish. So the aims of the workshop today is to start off with talking a little bit about what stress is and where it comes from. And then we'll move on to some ways of how we can manage stress better. And that will include going through a series of relaxation techniques. And towards the end, we'll just bring it all together and then think about how you might want to put these techniques into practice.
Great. So I guess just to start off with, we'll be thinking a bit about what stress is. So stress means maybe something different to each one of us, and we all experience stress differently, but we know it's something that's really common. We're all going to experience it at some point of our lives, at some point in time. And I guess for today, we'll be defining stress as that word that people use when they're describing how maybe their demands in their lives start to become too great for them to cope with, or feel like they're too much to cope with at times. And there's a few things we want to remember about stress, really. We know it's there for a reason, and it's very natural and something that can actually sometimes be quite helpful for us. So it can help us sharpen our performance, and the right amount of stress can lead us to maybe taking action on something. So for example, if we're worried or stressed about an exam, a deadline, then we can maybe start revising or prepping and take action on it. But what we also know is that too much stress can start to maybe impair our performance and start to become a bit more unhelpful, or might start to make us feel more anxious or irritable, or feel more unable to cope, or potentially susceptible to kind of illnesses or things like ulcers. And I guess hopefully with the workshop today, we'll be thinking about what stress means for you. And it's important to be aware of our own tolerance levels for what we're able to deal with so that we can try and live within those limits and also build up some coping strategies to be able to manage stress for ourselves. So we don't want to be thinking about getting rid of stress completely. It's there for us for a reason, but we just want to learn how to maybe deal with it. And I guess the first step in doing that is really thinking to ourselves about where our own stress is coming from and what type of stresses there are. So, as you can see on the slide that's up on your screens now, we can sometimes think about splitting stress into maybe two key types. And this is maybe the triggers or where we're finding that stress is coming from in ourselves. We're all going to be worried and stressed about different things. But we could split it into maybe external and internal stressors. So, external stressors are maybe those things that are happening around us or outside of us in our kind of external environment. So, it could be things like exams, it could be friends, family, job, finances, moving house, bereavement, lots of different things that might be happening in our lives that cause us to have stress and cause that kind of feeling building up inside us. Equally, it might be that there are internal stressors that cause us stress. So these can be those types of things that are maybe like our own expectations of what we maybe need to do or should be doing. It could be things like those kind of persistent worries we have about whether it's kind of what we're doing or money or getting things done. So often that can be those kind of phrases we use for ourselves of I should do this or I must do this, I need to get this right, I need to get this done. And as Hedvig was saying at the start, if you have got a kind of pen or paper around with you now, or indeed the kind of supplementary materials that were attached to or you could download, it might be worth just pausing the video for a minute or two and taking some time for yourselves to think about what are the things that make you stressed? Where is some of your stress coming from? Because once we can start to identify that, we can start to think about, right, how can I manage this stress and how can I handle this or respond to this stress? And that's what we'll come on to think about later in a bit more detail. So maybe just take a moment, pause the video, start to write down some of those both internal and external stressors that are coming up for you. And then when you're ready, unpause and we'll come back to the next slide. Okay. So what you can see now is a diagram, and you can see it's called the 5 areas. And this is something we often use in CBT or cognitive behavioural therapy. And already we've started to speak about stress, what stress is, and some of the things that might cause us stress. But what's also important is to think about maybe how we're then finding ourselves kind of maintaining that stress or keeping that stress going. And within CBT, we use this model here because what we know is that the way in which we think maybe about ourselves, about the world, about others around us can affect how we feel, both emotionally, both physically, which then in turn can influence what we do, how we behave, and how we cope, which in turn then again affects how we feel and think. And essentially it becomes potentially a bit like a cycle, which can either be helpful or unhelpful, and maybe just kind of maintain some of those kind of problems that might be going on for us, or indeed that stress that we're experiencing. So there's 4 key areas here. So our thoughts, so these are kind of our cognitive symptoms that we might describe in CBT, so how we think, those things that are running through our mind and our head that we're thinking about. Our physical symptoms are how we feel in our body, our emotions, so how we kind of feel emotionally, and then our behaviour, so what we actually do. And there's a generic example, I guess, here on the screen about how we might feel when we're feeling stressed. So if we're thinking about some of those triggers, maybe in this scenario, a trigger point was there was a lot of deadlines for your work and lots of things you have to do. Maybe you're feeling then quite anxious about that. Maybe you're starting to have those thoughts of it's too much, I can't do it all, I'm not going to get it done, which in turn makes you feel more anxious. Maybe you start to feel quite tense, quite kind of on edge about that. As a result, maybe that means you work longer hours to get all the work done. Maybe stop socializing so that you can get that work done, which in turn potentially makes you feel more tired, maybe makes you feel a bit down, maybe makes you feel more anxious. And maybe that all leads to those more thoughts of it's too much, I can't do it, I can't cope. So essentially, it's just an example of how we can find ourselves getting caught in this cycle that goes round and round, and we find it maybe quite hard to break out of. So with CBT and hopefully some of the strategies we're going to cover today, we'll just be thinking how to maybe break that cycle and hopefully turn it to a bit more of a positive or a virtuous one, as opposed to more of a kind of vicious cycle. And we tend to do that by focusing predominantly on our behaviours and on our thoughts. So thinking about how to maybe manage our thoughts slightly differently and things we can, I guess, do differently and change the way we react or respond or cope with stress that's coming in from us. And then from doing that, that in turn will hopefully have a positive impact on our emotions and our physical symptoms. So just creating that more, I suppose, virtuous cycle for us. And what I would say is it's always helpful to just for yourselves think about the cycle that you might be finding yourself in and thinking about how that might change in different scenarios. We will have kind of these different reactions dependent on what the problem is, dependent on what the trigger point is, and we might feel differently in different times. But sometimes it can be helpful just to take a moment and think about your own thoughts, your own behaviours, especially when you're feeling maybe more stressed, and reflecting on that for yourself. And by doing that, it helps us just build that understanding of how maybe we're responding to our own stress. So feel free, if you want to now, you can even take a moment again to pause the video and just reflect on that a bit for yourself and maybe complete your own cycle for a time, say, that you felt stressed maybe recently, and just see how it feels doing that. And then when we're ready, feel free to unpause and come back again. Okay.
So now we'll move on to think a little bit about how we might be coping with stress. So you might have taken a bit of time and looked at the 5 areas and how you might be responding to stress. And we might then think of ourselves as a bit of a pair of scales. So on one side, there's the demands that are placed on us, and that can be both internal or external. And then on the other side, it's then our ability to cope with these demands. And the goal is, in coping with stress, we want those scales to be balanced, because we do know there will always be stresses that come our way, both external and internal. But then we want to have a good set of coping abilities to manage those. However, if we're having lots of external stresses coming our way, and maybe also putting lots of pressure on ourselves with the internal stresses, and also adding to that, we don't feel like we have a lot of coping abilities, or we don't believe in ourselves in being able to cope with the stresses that are placed on us. We might then get that tipping of the scales become very imbalanced, and we get the stress response that Chiara was talking about in the 5 areas. So what can we then do if we are finding ourselves in a situation where our scales are imbalanced, so to speak? So that's where we then want to start thinking about how we can either reduce the demands, and that's both the external demands and the internal demands that we put on ourselves. And we want to think about how we can increase our own coping abilities. Or we might want to think about doing both at the same time. So there are some, a starting point to this is then thinking about what kind of strategies might we want to put into place to reduce our stress levels. So coming back to the 5 areas that Chiara was talking about, you might have noticed on the behaviour in the behaviour box, you might have written some things that you're doing more of when you're stressed. And that can be both helpful or unhelpful behaviours. So some common things that we might do to help ourselves when we're feeling stressed is maybe delegation, using relaxation techniques, doing simple things to look after ourselves day to day, like exercise. But then on the other side, we might have noticed then that there are some things that we do more of that feel like they are helpful in the short term, but actually in the long term, we know that they might keep us going in that vicious cycle a bit more. So using other things to try and cope, such as alcohol or drugs, maybe trying to avoid the things that are stressing us or avoid tackling the task that we're feeling anxious about. Or maybe we're someone that starts then taking on more when we're stressed and having less boundaries. And we'll move on to talking a little bit more about mapping what our stressors are, and also then what our helpful and unhelpful behaviours in response to stress are.
So, as Hedvig just said, it's quite nice to be able to kind of map all of this together. So, taking into account both the, I guess, internal, external stressors, what's coming in, as well as how we're coping with that, and seeing it all as a bit of a bigger picture. And one way of doing that is by something called the stress bucket. So it's an analogy, really. And in your booklet that hopefully you've been able to download, that's available on pages 8 and 9, there's a printed version of this stress bucket as well, or you might be able to kind of zoom in on that and find it helpful to read if the writing's small on the slides. But essentially, first of all, I just want you to imagine a bucket. So we know buckets can all be different sizes. They hold different amounts of water. But what happens is if we keep filling that bucket with water, eventually it's going to overflow. So in the same way, we can perhaps think about our stress levels as water kind of in that bucket. So we can all, as different people, handle different amounts of stress. And that may change throughout our lives as well. But what we know is that if we keep filling in and keep having more and more stressors coming into us, whether they're external stressors or internal stressors, it just starts to maybe become a lot or starts to overflow, and we start to feel like those scales on the or the balance on those scales, as Hedvig mentioned, kind of tip, and maybe we feel overwhelmed and feel too stressed, and it starts to become too much to handle. So what we want to be able to do is almost drain some of that stress away, or you want to be able to drain some of that water out of the bucket. So in the diagram, you can see at the top, there's the stressors coming in. So they're the internal, the external stressors. And the way they split it up here is it thinks about academic stress. That could also be work-based stress. There's environmental stress, so things kind of to do with your work, living environment, situations you're in, maybe conflicts with people as well. And that maybe sometimes links to maybe the interpersonal stress tap that's coming in. So stress, say, from relationships with loved ones, family, friends. And then that more intrapersonal stress. So things that are maybe coming from your own, say, physical health, financial situation, and your own mental well-being. And when we're becoming more stressed, we might notice these taps are kind of turning on more and filling up those buckets. We might start to use unhelpful coping strategies to be able to get rid of some of that immediate stress. So as the previous couple of slides were saying, maybe things like drinking more alcohol, maybe withdrawing ourselves, maybe under or overeating. These things might all maybe help to reduce our stress a little bit in the short term, but actually may start to then add more stress in as we move on and as we move forward. So if we're drinking alcohol, maybe that the next day we then feel worse and we start judging ourselves for it. Maybe if we're withdrawing from people and then struggling to make those connections, that adds more stress in and kind of refills our bucket or refills that stress. So what we want to be able to do is really build on the kind of two taps that are at the bottom there. So the problem focused and emotion focused coping strategies. And there are likely to be different ones you're using right now. Some might be some of the helpful behaviours you may be doing, like talking to others or reading, listening to music. And hopefully what we'll do is add a couple of extra strategies as we go on in the workshop today, so that you can just build on this. And I suppose the problem focused coping strategies are the ones that tackle the source of the problem. So strategies when you can influence or have some control over the situation, whereas the emotion focused strategies can be those ones that might help to decrease that kind of negative emotion we feel, especially if we don't have maybe control over what that outside stressor is, for example. So then hopefully, if we can keep developing some of these tabs, we can help create a bit of a buffer zone. So a bit of a space whereby all that water we're kind of filling into the bucket is being drained out, so that when more stressors do come in or when more taps are turned on, we don't so quickly overfill and we're able to manage and balance those scales. So it's very much just an analogy to pull everything we've started to talk about already together, and something that you can kind of add to and keep adjusting, especially as maybe stress has changed, or especially if you develop more kind of coping skills. But just a nice way to draw it all together. And it might be right now, again, you want to have a pause and start to fill in your own stress bucket, or it might be something you want to do after the workshop. But there is a template there on your booklet that you can download to fill out your own bucket, and I definitely encourage you at some point to have a think about that if you don't want to do that now. Okay.
So we'll now move on to talking a little bit more about how we might go on to either reduce internal demands or and external demands. So the first tool that we've started with today was then just becoming aware of what we do when we are stressed. What kind of things of our helpful behaviours do we notice become really difficult to do, and what kind of things of the unhelpful behaviours might we start doing more of? And one of the very big contributors to how stress affects us is the demands that we put on ourselves, which then in turn often can lead to worrying. So worrying is something that we might say is quite an unhelpful way of dealing with our problems, because it feeds into that vicious cycle of stress and increases our stress levels. So worrying is something that everyone does. It's incredibly normal, and actually at times it can be helpful to worry, because it draws your attention to something that's important that you need to problem solve or deal with. And it can help you be prepared and make an action plans to deal with any kind of situation that might be occurring to you. So a typical example that Chiara already started touching on was the exam situation. So you might have an exam coming up, you worry about passing, so you then revise and study for your exam. But worrying becomes unhelpful if it takes away from you being able to problem solve or to proactively work towards your goals. So with the exam example, if you're so worried about passing the exam that you're finding it impossible to study, that worry is then not going to be helpful. So really what we want to start thinking about then is how can we reduce that worrying that increases us putting more demands on ourselves, but actually ultimately takes us away from being able to deal with the practical things or the stresses that are happening to us. And also another thing with worrying is that if we spend a lot of time worrying, we're not able to actively do anything to solve our problems, but also it's taking away from us being able to enjoy other things. So I'm sure a lot of people might recognize that feeling of maybe having left work of a really stressful day and taking work home with you, and noticing that you're spending lots and lots of time, maybe while you're cooking dinner or spending time with your family, or you're in a social situation. Actually, your mind's somewhere completely different. It's at work thinking about that task that you have tomorrow. But actually, you're not doing anything actively to solve that problem or work towards that task that's there tomorrow. but also is taking away from you having time to rest and enjoy yourself. So one way that we might start with looking at reducing worry is using a tool that's called the worry tree. And it starts with us really identifying what we're worrying about and finding out whether there is something that we can or cannot do about our worry. So we say that we have two different types of worries. The first one is a practical worry. So that is anything that is in the here and now that we can do something about to solve it, or we can plan it in to solve it at a later time in the near future. The other type of worry that we have is hypothetical worries. And they are the kind of worries that are so far off in the future that there might not be anything that we could do about them, but also they might be worries that there isn't anything to do about them at all. So a typical way of spotting a hypothetical worry is that if it starts with what if. So we might notice when we are very stressed and we're having lots of things going on in our life, we might worry a lot about the different things that are stressing us, but also going into lots of different scenarios of what might or might not happen. So we want to use the worry tree to start identifying what's hypothetical and what's a practical worry. So if the answer to the question, is there anything that I can do about my worry, is no, then we know that it's a hypothetical worry. If the answer is yes, then we know it's a practical worry, and we want to either make a plan for later for how to problem solve this situation, or we want to deal with it right now in the moment. But either way, we always know that with a practical worry, there's always something that we can do about it. There is a way that we can solve it. And we might notice that we have practical worries, we've made the plan, we're going to tackle the problem, or we have already dealt with the problem, but we find ourselves still continuing to worry about it. Then we know that those worries that are following that are part of the hypothetical worries. So there's one technique to deal with practical worries that we'll go on to in a little bit called problem solving. And the way to deal with hypothetical worries is to try and park the worry, which is something that can be incredibly difficult to do, especially if we are someone that notices that we worry a lot, or we're in a situation where there are lots of stresses, and we're having maybe lots of the physical symptoms of anxiety with it as well, that makes all those worries feel so much more intense. But we want to try and refocus our attention away from the hypothetical worry, because we know that worrying about a hypothetical worry is futile. It causes us increase in the physical symptoms of anxiety, but also it takes away from us being able to be in the here and now and enjoy things that are helpful for us. So we want to then try and use a technique of refocusing our attention. And there's one of the materials that you can download that's called the 5 Senses Mindfulness Exercise. And you might have done something similar if you've tried practicing mindfulness. However, this is slightly different in that it focuses on taking your attention back into the here and now. So we might then use all our 5 senses to try and focus our mind away from the worry and into the here and now. So we might then start noticing the things around us that we can see, or the sounds that are around us that we can hear, the temperature of where we are, the light in the room, the different colours of the different items that are around us. But also noticing how our body physically feels, maybe if we're sat in a chair. And even using senses such as our smell to notice what we can smell in the room that we're in, and even what can we taste. And by using all our 5 senses, we then help reduce a bit of those physical symptoms of anxiety, because we're slowing down our heart rate, we're maybe breathing a bit more regularly, but we're also actively taking an approach of deciding to take our mind away from that worry. So on the sheet that you can download, it will go through this step by step with you. And like I said with this, it's really difficult to start taking our mind off worrying if we're someone that usually worries quite a lot. But by practicing it, it will get easier, because basically what we're doing is taking and changing the way that we respond to a stressor and respond to a worry. So we're used to going into that worry process and going down the spiral of the what ifs. And by using this technique, we're doing the exact opposite. And that's why it's difficult in the beginning and it takes time to get used to, but do keep practicing it. And the more you practice it, the easier you'll get to use that technique when you are feeling at a higher level of stress or anxiety. However, the important thing to remember with refocusing your attention, or parking the worry, so to speak, is that it is only for hypothetical worries. It's not there to use for practical worries and us avoiding maybe dealing with problems that are there that need our attention. They are only there. It's only there to use for the hypothetical worries that we know there isn't anything that we can do anything about.
So, as Hedvig was saying, we've just been speaking about the worry tree, trying to identify those types of worries, and we've gone over some ways to maybe deal with the hypothetical worries. So those worries that where there isn't something we can do, there isn't an action we can take. But what we want to focus on next is thinking about what to do if you've worked through that worry tree and you've realised, actually, yes, this is a practical problem. There is something I can do about this. So thinking about maybe those external stressors or demands that are coming on us. So perhaps that might be something like money, job, family. And what we can do is, if we realise there's the answer to that question is yes, there's something I can do, we can use a technique called problem solving. So this is really helpful as it helps us break down our problems into more smaller, manageable steps, and also helps us think about some of the solutions that are available, goes through some pros and cons of each solution, and helps us come up with a bit of a plan. And it is quite, I guess, a systematic approach. So it's really helpful to just kind of sit down and work through this problem solving tool when you notice the problems coming up, and allowing yourself the time to do that. And what we might notice is usually, especially if there's a lot going on for us, especially if we're feeling quite stressed or overwhelmed, we might not be dealing with these practical problems. We might be kind of putting them off, or we might feel really unsure about what to do or how to do it. So by allowing ourselves to go through this problem solving technique, it helps us just make us see things a bit clearer, and also allows us to realize actually we've gone through the options and hopefully get to the best decision or the best solution for us. So the next slide lists some of the problem solving steps for us. And I'll just talk through each of these steps as we kind of move forward. But essentially, what we've got is six key steps. So the first step is identifying what the problem is. And maybe if we use a bit of an example, it will help bring these steps to life a little bit. So say our problem is that we need to pay a bill and we don't have enough money for that bill, or we need to kind of pay a debt. So we want to really break that problem down and think about what the key problem is that we need to tackle here. And it's important, if there's a really big problem, to try and break it down into smaller steps. And we might need to do this a few times to be able to work through this process. But let's say for this example, the problem is I need to find £300 to pay my bill next week. The next step of that is, once we've identified the problem, is we want to brainstorm all of the solutions. And when we're doing this, we would encourage you to think about all of the possible solutions, even those really strange or silly ones, or things that feel a bit different or a bit like you would never do. And through doing that, and through kind of allowing ourselves to be a bit more creative, hopefully we can come up with a few solutions that we might not usually have done. And we can certainly do this by ourselves. Sometimes we might want to involve other people in that problem solving stage, if that feels helpful. But say, for example, we're thinking about this problem of I need this money to pay the bill. Maybe some of the solutions could be things like I'll ask a friend for money. I'll borrow some money from a friend, or I'll sell some clothes on eBay, or I'll rob a bank, or I will ask the bank for a loan. So just trying to list and write down as many of them as we can. Once we've done that, we want to move on to stage 3, which is going through the pros and cons of each of those solutions you've come up with. There might be a couple of solutions which you just outright kind of disregard straight away, especially if they're more kind of on the silly end of that scale. But we want to go through and write down the pros and cons for each, maybe considering kind of the benefits of it, thinking about if we are able to do that, if we've got the materials to do something, for example, and just trying to come up with as many for each solution as possible. The next step is choose one of those solutions, maybe choosing one that seems the best, the most realistic, and using the pros and cons you've come up with to help you decide on that. Once you've decided, the next step is essentially making a step-by-step plan. So trying to set up how you're going to kind of carry out that solution. So say if in our example, the solution that you picked was you're going to borrow money from a friend. You want to think about all of the kind of small steps and try to be as specific as possible when you're making your plan. Because by doing that and by setting ourselves kind of clearer things to do, maybe with time limits, maybe with a set plan, we're then more likely to do it and carry it out, and it just helps us kind of stick with it. So for example, maybe you're thinking about what friend you're going to ask, you're planning in a time when you're going to call them, you're making sure you plan in an idea of when you're going to pay them back if that's something that you need to think about, and thinking about any obstacles that might come up when you're doing this, and thinking about, right, if they ask this, maybe I could respond with this, or if I can't get a hold of them at the set time, maybe I'll send them a text. So thinking about what could be done if some of those obstacles might come up for yourself. Then once you've got your set plan, you need to test it, you need to try it out and try and stick with it and follow through with that plan as much as possible. And then the final stage is reviewing how it went. So did the problem get solved? How did it go? Or if not, are there any changes that I need to make? Is there anything I still need to do? And if for whatever reason the problem isn't solved at that point, what you can do is go back to those different solutions again, or those pros and con list, and pick a different option because you've got them there, you've already thought about them. And then again, go through the final few steps of making a new plan, following that through, and then reviewing. So, as I said, it's a very kind of systematic process, but something that can be really, really helpful when we're having those practical problems. And I guess the few key messages would be taking that time to sit there and work through it, writing it down, especially when we're doing this for the first few times, is really, really helpful. But also really remembering to try and break down the problems into as smaller problems as possible. So we're not trying to tackle anything that's too big at once. So we want to get kind of more manageable problems and manageable steps in place that we can take. Yeah. So,
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Vic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've now gone through quite a lot of different things around kind of reducing both external and internal demands, and we'll move on to a couple of different things in around increasing coping abilities. So this might be a good time to just take a little comfort break, and before we go on to talk about relaxation techniques, and then come back to listen in to the rest of the workshop. So for the next part of the workshop, we'll be looking at some ways of increasing our coping abilities. And one of the main ways that we can do that is to give ourselves more time to relax and also decrease those physical symptoms of stress. So we'll go through a couple of different ways that we can do that. But first, it's just helpful then to think a little bit about what is actually happening in our body when we are stressed. So when we perceive an event as stressful, and that can be something that's occurring externally or something that's happening internally that's making us feel stressed, it will increase, it will then trigger the release of stress hormones. So that's cortisol and also adrenaline. And that creates that physiological change in our body. So you might notice those kind of really common symptoms of anxiety of our heart rate increasing, maybe noticing that we're feeling more hot and sweaty, maybe even shaking and trembling, but also more longer term changes like carrying lots of tension in our body. So what's then happening in our body when we are responding to a stressful event is the fight or flight response. And you might be familiar with this in that this is the way that us humans have evolved to respond to danger, and it's what's kept us alive. So when there is something dangerous that is happening, we'll have that increase in cortisol and adrenaline that will get us ready to either fight off and face the dangerous situation that's happening or run away to safety. So it's really a healthy and natural way to respond to danger that's there to keep us alive. However, with a lot more of the kind of modern day stresses, like worries, finances, work pressures, we get those same responses, but it creates then more chronic stress that's then more problematic. So really, what we want to think about is that we don't want to take away our response to stress in any way, because that's not possible. We do want to be able to be alert when it's needed, but we want to turn the dial down. So we're responding to the right stresses in the right way. So we might think of it that our stress response has become like an overactive car alarm. So it's really helpful that the alarm goes off if someone's trying to break into our car, but it's not so helpful if it's going off every time there's a leaf blowing over the car. So the main ways that we'll then be looking at helping reduce that physical response is through relaxation exercises.
So one of the first relaxation exercises we're going to introduce is something called progressive muscle relaxation. Sometimes it might also be referred to as deep muscle relaxation or DMR. So just be aware of that if you see that out there anywhere. So with PMR or progressive muscle relaxation, it can be really, really helpful as it can help us reduce our overall levels of tension. So it's quite a physical relaxation technique in the sense that it's using our bodies. So as Hedvig just started to mention, we activate that fight or flight response when we're becoming stressed. And one of the ways that our bodies react is our muscles often may tense up quite a lot. And when we're feeling very stressed or more stressed, we often hold a lot of tension in our bodies. Sometimes we might be quite aware of that tension. Sometimes we might not be as aware of it. But what we know is if we can help release some of that tension and help our bodies become more relaxed, we can help prompt that more rest and digest response and hopefully help to reduce some of that adrenaline or overall kind of stress and anxiety we might be feeling. So PMR is a technique. It goes through each of our body's main muscle groups in turn. And essentially we would be tensing and then relaxing them. And that helps in a couple of ways. So it helps us learn that difference between maybe when our bodies are tense to when they're relaxed, which in turn can maybe help us be more aware of when we're feeling that tension in our body in the day-to-day kind of scenario, potentially helping us recognize when we're becoming more stressed and then allowing ourselves to maybe use some of these relaxation tools to help us kind of slow down that process or indeed not kind of activate that fight or flight response in the same way. So I'll talk through it briefly, but also what I would recommend is potentially having a practice of this yourselves, and hopefully you'll be able to see a link that you can follow on the resources available linked in with this workshop for the PMR technique, so you can practice it. But essentially, a couple of things that are important to notice. Although we are tensing our muscles, it shouldn't hurt. So it shouldn't be painful at all. And if you do have any injuries or suffer with kind of chronic pain or arthritis or any kind of muscle spasms in any particular muscle groups, you don't have to do it in that area, or don't do it kind of in the same way necessarily. And it's very much kind of important for you to know how your own body is whilst you're kind of practicing PMR. Some people find it helpful. Some people may also prefer other techniques. But what is really helpful, I think, with all of the techniques we're going to cover today is giving them a go and maybe practicing them quite a few times. And the more and more we practice these things, the easier and more effective they tend to become. So when we're doing PMR, we can do it anywhere. Sometimes it's helpful to sit down or lie down. And I just want you to have a quick practice of essentially clenching or tensing your fist. So just to get a feel for what it might be like if you can't listen to the other recording straight away now, what I'd suggest you do is just take a second, find yourself in a comfortable position, and then when I say so, we're going to clench our fist for about 5 seconds. And then when I say relax, we'll just relax that muscle and relax our hand and just pause for another 5 seconds. And just see what it feels like to do that. So when you're ready, I want you to clench your fist now. And now relax. So that's the process that you'll be going through in each of the different muscle groups. So if you're able to now, I would recommend pausing the video and listening to one of the recordings available. It's also sometimes helpful just to take a bit of a note for yourself about how your body feels right now. Maybe rate it on a scale of like 0 to 10 in terms of how stressed or tense you feel. And then once you've finished the practical exercise, so once you've done the video or the recording, you can start the workshop up again and we'll come back into it. So hopefully those of you who have done the recording, just think about how you feel right now, and then we'll come on to another technique when you're ready. Yeah.
So the next relaxation exercise that we'll look at is around our breathing. So when we are feeling anxious and stressed, so we're having that fight or flight response being triggered, it will often change our breathing into it being more shallow or even hyperventilating, which basically means that our body is taking in too much of oxygen, and there's not that kind of nice balance between the oxygen and carbon dioxide. So you might recognize these kind of symptoms from having felt anxious, that if our breathing is very shallow, we might feel a bit more dizzy, a bit more lightheaded, or even less focused or confused. So then by slowing our breathing down and getting back a balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide, it will help relieve stress levels, and we'll feel better able to cope because we'll feel more able to think clearly and deal with the situation that's at hand. And it's something that you can use any time if you're noticing that you're feeling a bit more anxious and your breathing is starting to get more shallow. So we'll go through it today together. And it's something that can be really helpful to use for about 3 minutes, just to give enough time for the kind of rest and digest system to get started. There are links to audios that you can listen to where someone will guide you through a relaxation sequence, but also on the materials that we've added to this workshop, there's a little guide that takes you through it step by step that you can read if you don't have access to the audio tapes. But basically, controlled breathing is all about getting control over the breath, so it's not shallow. So you're actually breathing with your diaphragm. So to start off with, just take your hands and place them on your stomach, so around your belly button. And you will start off with breathing slowly in through your nose and out through your mouth. And you should feel that the breath coming down into your stomach, and that your stomach is expanding when you're breathing in. And as you're breathing out, you should notice that your stomach is then going back in again. So first, just take a moment and see if you can feel that when you're breathing in, that your stomach goes out, and when you're breathing out, that your stomach goes in. And when you're noticing that you have have that control. Start breathing in through your nose and doing it in 3 seconds. So breathing in, 1, 2, 3, and then breathing out through your mouth, 1, 2, 3. And keep practicing this for around 3 minutes. So this might be a good time where you then stop our workshop and just listen to one of the audios, or go through it step by step through the guide on the materials, and then come back and maybe take a moment and reflect if you're noticing any difference. Did you feel more relaxed doing this? And you might find that this is something that is good to then practice regularly. So not only when you're stressed and anxious, because it can be a lot harder to put these things into place if you haven't practiced them before. So maybe try them out maybe once a day for a little while, get used to controlling your breathing. So then as you might then be put into a situation where you're feeling more anxious, it'll be much easier to get control over breathing again and calm down the nervous system.
And now the final relaxation exercise we want to introduce is visualization. So this is something that can be accessed in a lot of different ways, and we've attached again a link for you that you can have a practice of this called Leaves on a Stream. So this is one specific visualization exercise that you can use, but I guess the key things to know about visualization is it's a bit of a kind of mental process, so a way that we use our imagination and our memory to maybe kind of immerse ourselves into either a relaxing or a happy place, which can help just relieve some of our stress. So it could be a place that we've been to before, a place we would like to go, or a place like we can imagine would be relaxing for us. So some people find it helpful to follow a guided visualization exercise. Some people might create their own scripts, and either can work for you. And it's something that can be done anytime. Often we talk about doing it by closing our eyes, and it just helps us almost like let go of the world for a couple of minutes and takes us to a kind of more relaxing place. And I guess what we know is that our minds are very much trained to think, they're trained to wander. So you might find during relaxation practices, and especially during visualization, that your mind starts to wander. And that's okay. If it does, just recognize that it is, accept that, and then come back to it and come back to the visualization of whatever it might be. So the one that you will be able to access that we've linked into for the workshop is all about focusing on a kind of stream and about leaves. But essentially, if you listen to it, it guides you through it really nicely and helps you set it up. And it's just a way to, as we said, I guess, focus your attention on that for the moment and let go of some of those thoughts or worries or stresses that are passing you by. You'll also be able to find lots of other visualization exercises out there, and there's different ones available for different people. Sometimes people find certain voices more or less helpful, so sometimes testing a few of them out can be beneficial, and I definitely recommend you do that for yourselves. But I'd say for now, take a moment, pause the video again, and sign in and link it up with one of those relaxation exercises, so the Leaves on the Stream link, and give it a practice, see how you feel, and then when you're ready, come back and just take a moment to again notice how you feel after having done the exercise. Okay, so hopefully now you've had that chance to do 3 of those different exercises, you've had a bit of a practice of them. And as we've touched on after each one, it's really helpful just to maybe take a moment to yourself right now and think, how do I feel in my body? How are my stress levels right now? And maybe compare that to how you felt maybe 15, 20 minutes ago before we started this relaxation part of the workshop. And you'll see on the slides there's some links available. So there's the SoundCloud iCope link, which has all of these exercises that we've gone through today, and other links available, including some Mental Health Foundation podcasts, which has some useful resources. Other apps and things are out there, many of which you may be familiar with. There's things like Headspace and Calm, lots of different resources. And even on YouTube, you can find examples of all the things we've gone through today, as well as others. And sometimes just building a bit of a resource off those can be really, really helpful for us.
Okay, so we've now come to the end of the stress and relaxation workshop, and we've gone through quite a lot of different techniques around how to manage stress. So we started off with talking about what stress is and how we notice it in our bodies, linking it in with the vicious cycle, and looking at what kind of behaviors or thinking patterns that might keep our stress going for us. We then moved on to looking at how to reduce internal demands with how to manage worrying, and how to reduce external demands with looking at problem solving, and then different relaxation techniques to help start off the rest and digest system instead of the fight or flight, so a way to cope with those physical symptoms of stress and anxiety. So now it's up to you to try and incorporate these techniques into your day-to-day life. And I would say to try one or two to start off with, and practice them for a little while and see how you get on with them. And you might have noticed that there are certain techniques that you like better or more interesting to you, but I would still recommend trying all of them at some point, because you might be surprised that there is a technique that is more helpful than you thought it would be. But also, when you are starting to practice these things, not to do too much. So build it up slowly and do it bit by bit, and don't put too much pressure on yourself to do everything every day, but try and incorporate it in a routine. So try and fit it in where you can, and build it up slowly. So then moving on to what happens next is that you can also get access to a lot of different books around stress and managing stress, but also do keep referring back to the materials that you can download, and use the different links for the different audio resources, how to do relaxation exercises, and keep practicing. And thank you so much for attending the workshop.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure having you with us today.